Keith, welcome back to the show. For all those listening and watching, you have a wonderful lecture prepared for us. It's called the Reactivity Schema Theory of Consciousness, and the lecture is Uncovering the Magic of Consciousness. You presented this prior to this episode of Mind Body Solution. Perhaps you want to start by telling us about that conference, and then, yeah, the stage is yours.
Oh, thanks, Tevin. And thanks for giving me the chance to present this again. And I hope to discuss it with you as we go through. Mm-hmm. Yes, I gave this talk at a conference that was held in Siena. I gave it by Zoom. It was held in Siena at the end of June. It was the inaugural conference of a new Center for Consciousness Studies, headed by Dmitry Volkov and Pietro Paconti, and I think others. I apologize if I've missed out names. The title of the conference was Uncovering the Magic of Consciousness, Philosophy, Neuroscience, and AI. I think a nod there in the title to the title of Nicholas Humphrey's 2011 book, Soul Dust, The Magic of Consciousness. But it's an analogy. The analogy with magic is one that I like myself very much. So I call it the Reactivity Schema Theory of Consciousness. That title is provisional. It may change, but it does capture something about what I want to say. And this is the first time I've presented this. It's certainly not a completely new idea in the field, but I'm developing it in my own way. And I hope people find it interesting. So let's go through it.
I'm looking forward to
it. Wait, let's see if I can just do something here. There's an effect here. It didn't work. No, there's supposed to be an effect on that slide, but it's not working. So never mind. It's supposed to morph into its color inverted into a color inverted version of itself. You'll see it without the animation later. Okay, so the illusionist future. So we've talked about illusionism before, and perhaps those who are not who haven't heard that talk might be wise to listen to it to get an idea of what illusionism is and what I'm trying to do, the large picture. As I see it, the illusionist approach to consciousness has two aspects. One is negative. It's rejecting a certain conception of what consciousness is. So one for which I use the label phenomenal realism, which is the idea that consciousness involves the existence of an irreducibly subjective world of private mental qualities, mental versions of the colors and sounds and smells and tastes and so on that we've normally that we ascribe to things around us in the world. So illusionism says that's a kind of illusion, not an illusion it's not a hallucination or something that's just a complete fantasy. There's something real happening there that we talk about in that way as a world of private qualities, but it's not quite what we think it is. So I'm not saying that consciousness isn't real. I'm saying that it's not quite what we think it is. But the other side to illusionism is a proposal for a constructive account of what consciousness is, a positive account to replace that. We've got to say, well, consciousness isn't there.
Yes.
So it's nothing. No, we need an alternative vision. And this is part of the alternative vision. And now the image there is what happens when you ask an AI, generative AI, to design a signpost that says to the illusionist future. Designs a nice signpost. It tries to do the words, but generative AI has a problem where the visual, the image generation programs have a problem with words. They don't seem to be able to deal with them very well. So there you go. Now let's see. So the two positive tasks for the illusionist. One is to give some account of what consciousness is that is not couched in the terms of phenomenal realism. So illusionists are not saying consciousness doesn't exist. They're saying it's not what you think it is. Not saying that pains and pleasures and smells and tastes and things are not real. Of course they're real. They're saying that there's a certain picture of what they are that is misleading. And this picture says that when you smell something, there is the external stimulus, whatever it is, the molecules that are impacting on the receptors in your nose and in the back of your throat. Those somehow trigger brain activity, and this brain activity somehow produces a kind of internal quality, an internal smell that's private, just for you, that only you know about. The molecules are out there for everyone to smell, but this private smell sensation, this private quality, smell quality, is only for you, and that's what you directly experience, and then you react to that. You might think, what's the you here? Is this you a little thing, private thing inside your head as well? That's the view that illusionists reject. It may seem hard to reject it. It may seem the obvious interpretation of what's happening, but the illusionists say there are so many problems with it, not just because it doesn't fit in with a scientific picture of the world, a physicalist picture, but internal problems. How is this internal you aware of this internal quality? Does it have does it sense this quality in some way? In the way that your nose senses the molecules, the nose senses the molecules, that creates brain activity. The brain activity creates this quality, and then is there some little sense organ in there that senses the quality and reacts to it? Well, if that's how it goes, why, and then produces further brain activity afterwards? Well, then what's the point of this little quality being sensed and producing more brain activity? Why not just cut from the brain activity produced by the external molecules straight to the further brain activity? Or is this quality somehow just, what is it doing? What changes is it causing? If it's causing changes, well, let's focus on those, because those are what matter, the downstream effects. If it's not causing any changes, then what's the point of it? It's easy. It's possible to pick apart this model and show that it doesn't really work, however intuitive it might seem. Okay, so then the illusionist has to give some alternative models. So that's one task for the illusionist. The second is to explain why we tend to take this phenomenally realist view of consciousness, why we tend to conceptualize consciousness in this way that as the creation of private mental qualities and their presentation to some inner observer. It's a view that Daniel Dennett called the Cartesian theatre. Cartesian because it refers to Descartes and his idea that there is an immaterial soul that communicates with the brain to a particular place, the pineal gland. The theatre, because there's a presentation there. The stimulation creates these qualities that are then presented somehow to an observer. So there's where the outer world is presented to our senses, and then the inner world is presented to what? The self, the soul. So the question is, how that view seems very compelling to some people, not perhaps to everyone, but it seems very, very compelling to some people. So much so that they find anyone who denies it is either being disingenuous or just deliberately provocative, or perhaps isn't really conscious themselves. But it is possible to challenge it, and it's possible to explain, I think, why that view seems so compelling to us. And those are the two tasks then: to provide an alternative account of consciousness and to explain why the account that I think we should reject is so compelling. Now, with regards to one, I'm just, for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to assume a certain answer, which is very, very vague, but that I think is a good feature. It's a view that Daniel Dennett proposed, and it's simply this: that for a bit of information, information about the world, to become conscious, take the information about the smell that we were talking about, for it to become conscious is just for it to have a sufficiently large effect on on us, on our psychology, to trigger enough reactions, psychological reactions, that it becomes famous, if you like, in the brain. These reactions would include perhaps triggering memories, disposing us to do certain things, perhaps. If it's a smell, we might be disposed to, if it's an unpleasant smell, disposed to move away from it. It might trigger physiological reactions. Some bad smells can perhaps make you produce a sort of visceral physiological reaction. It might call up whole sorts of memories. It might prime certain sorts of decisions. What you're going to, how you're going to act in response to the thing. It might have, there's emotion. Did I mention emotional reactions? It might trigger feelings of disgust or of pleasure. Note that I said feelings there. That's not catching myself out, because I will give a similar account of what feelings are. And it will predispose you to make certain linguistic reports. You will say, oh, there's a strong smell of whatever it is in here. And the idea is that a particular bit of information about the world that's detected by your sense organs gets to be conscious if it has enough of these effects. If it becomes famous in the, if you like, in the cognitive economy. So it triggers enough reactions, not necessarily behavioral reactions. I'm talking about psychological reactions. Changes enough little settings in your brain for it to make a big difference. So now that you'll say, well, that's vague. What counts as something being famous or not famous in this loose metaphorical sense? Maybe no hard line between things that are famous and things. Well, no, that's, I think, all to the good, because try to measure consciousness, try to determine at what level, say, someone becomes conscious of a particular stimulus. You show them a very faint light, say, and you gradually increase the intensity of the light and tell me when you can see it. Okay, that's at a certain point you'll say, I can see it. But then if you look at other reactions, perhaps non-verbal reactions and eye movements and this sort of thing, you might find a different threshold at which you get the response that you take to be indicative of consciousness. Depending on how you measure it, you can get different answers to the question of when someone's conscious of something or not. Maybe consciousness isn't as hard-edged as we tend to think it is. So maybe this fame in the brain is getting at something. Of course it's loose, of course it's just an analogy, a metaphor, but maybe that's what we need at this stage until we get a more detailed picture of what exactly is happening when a perceptual stimuli are processed. And after all, we know quite a bit about the early stages, say, of visual processing in the brain. We know about the visual cortex and how it's structured and the different features that are detected there by different parts and how this information is integrated. But what happens then? Well, then lots and lots and lots of things can happen. This information becomes available, if it's, at least if it's attended to, this information can become available, if the stimulus is attended to, the information can become available to a wide range of cognitive systems, sometimes said to be globally broadcast. Okay, globally broadcast. Now, what can happen then? Well, pretty much anything can happen, depending on your expectations, your background, your background beliefs and desires at that particular moment. Pretty much anything can happen. You might be, the particular smell might be a trigger for any kind of behavior, depending on what you think that smell signifies. It might signify that there's a gas leak, we've got to evacuate the building. It might signify that something's burning and you've got to rush to the oven. It might signify that anything. Okay, so this information could have a completely open-ended range of uses. How do you measure that? How do you assess that complexity? How do you decide when it's appropriate to talk about the information being conscious or not? It's very, very difficult. This is why something like fame in the brain is a good metaphor, because how do you imagine the analogous question, consider the analogous question, how do you determine when a person has become famous or not? They have to have a sufficient sufficiently large social effect. But there are many different ways of having that, and many different kinds of effect. Good effects. People can become famous for some notorious deed, famous for some wonderful deed, famous in particular, but there is specific ways, famous in more general ways for being a very wise and kind person, say, and so on and so on. So I'm going to just, but what's crucial to this, though, is that there's no mention of any inner presentation. There's no mention of qualia. There's no mention of the Cartesian theatre. There's a notion of being a sufficiently potent cluster of effects within the cognitive system, within the brain. So, as I said, that's vague and all the better for it. It's an example of what Dan called meanwhileism. Maybe there should be an E in there after the L, I'm not sure. A sort of holding position that will help us make a transition to a better way of thinking about consciousness. So we say reject phenomenal realism, take this fame in the brain idea as a sort of placeholder for the moment. And as we do more science, we all gradually be able to feel it in hopefully in constructive ways. The main thing is that it misses out the notion of the Cartesian theatre and introduces the idea of psychological effects as the core of what's happening. Now, regard to two, why do we take a phenomenally realist view of consciousness? Why does that seem so compelling? Well, here, my answer in a sentence is that it's something like an introspective illusion. Introspective because it involves our attending to our own experiences, our asking ourselves what this experience of smelling, whatever it is like, what this experience of pain is like, attending to it and trying to describe the experience itself considered as a mental state. So it's introspective, but it's illusory because it gives us a distorted, misleading idea of what we're attending to. It makes us the introspective processes induce us to think that what we're attending to is something like this presentation in an inner theatre. Whereas actually what we're attending to are complex processes within our brains, to put it crudely. So it's an introspective illusion produced by processes of neural self-monitoring. What's happening is that there are mechanisms, systems that are monitoring what's happening inside us and are inducing us to believe that we are that there is this inner presentation of mental qualities to a private self. When I say private self, I mean some sort of inner self, as opposed to the physical organism, the whole person. And that suggestion raises a number of questions, prompts a number of questions. What exactly is being monitored? Which aspects of brain activity are being monitored by introspection, by these introspective mechanisms? Why are they being monitored? What's the point of monitoring these particular aspects of brain activity involved in experience? And how does the monitoring of these aspects of experience produce the illusion? Note that when I say experience there, I'm using it in the non-phenomenal sense, the fame in the brain experience. And fame in the brain sense, an experience of a certain smell is what occurs when your olfactory system, olfactory receptors detect certain molecules, complex patterns of molecules. It's not as simple as detecting just one set of molecules. Detect certain complex patterns of odors in the air and produce a whole range of a huge range of effects. The information about those, that odor becomes neurally famous. That's the experience. I'm saying that aspects of that are being monitored by processes in the brain for some purpose, which we can discuss, and creating this illusion. Now, reactivity schema theory is really a theory of two. It's an account of what this introspective, how this introspective illusion is created, what is being monitored, why it's being monitored, and how it generates the illusion. So it's the answers to the what, why, and how questions. All right, that was one slide. Okay, do feel free to interject if you want with questions or comments. I'll be happy to.
No, Keith, if you want to, would you like to just clarify the why the name reactivity schema theory, just for anyone who's wondering?
That will come in a moment.
Okay, thank you.
We'll do that shortly. Sources of inspiration for this approach. One is the person who's been the source of inspiration for most of my thinking about consciousness and other matters, which is, of course, Daniel Dennett. Here's a picture that I took of him on the cruise in Greenland in 2014, which I was lucky enough to take part in. It looks as if the hat there is from a...
it says 2006, I say.
That's from some, I guess, from some sailing competition. Which you,
and to everyone watching behind Keith, in case they haven't seen the previous episode,
oh,
it's a
yes.
beautiful photo of Dan Dennett as well.
Yes, just there. Yes. Yes. So, what reactive landmarks? So I'm just going to read a couple of quotes here from Dan. What anchors our naive sense that there are such properties as qualia, these mysterious mental qualities produced by the brain? What anchors our naive sense that there are such properties as qualia are the multiple asymmetrical interdependent set of reactive dispositions by which we acquaint ourselves with the sensible world. So this is the fame in the brain, the different reactive dispositions that are triggered by a stimulus. Note this is reactive dispositions here. It doesn't mean actual reactions. This isn't a sort of behaviorist view that it's the actual behavior that you display. You may do nothing, but still an awful lot is happening in here because all sorts of behaviors and the other kinds of reactions are being, if not actually initiated, they're being what's the word, potentiated. Their tendency to be initiated is being increased. They're being primed, as it were. All sorts of, you can imagine all sorts of little sliders in the brain controlling different things, levels of different kinds of emotion, physiological reactions like heartbeat, the endocrine system, hormone production. You can imagine all these little sliders, and every time a new stimulus comes in, they have adjusted by brain systems. You know, they go up or down different ways, and this pattern of reactions, and that doesn't necessarily trigger any particular behavior at this moment, but it makes certain behaviors more likely next time, perhaps. I mean, some behaviors may be triggered, but sometimes it may just be a matter of shifting up and down these potentials within the brain, which will change your orientation to the world, as it were. Because of how these sliders are set down, they're not literally sliders, but because of how they're set, that sort of changes your orientation to, well, how you're going to respond to the next round of stimulation. If if the current stimulus is one that's something that indicates perhaps a threat, then all sorts of the warning levels will go up in different ways, which will make you more inclined to treat the next thing warily. And to raise alertness levels and attention levels and so on, and perhaps change the focus of attention, all sorts of things, attention, emotion, cognitive disposition to form beliefs, of course, memories may be activated. All of this is, a lot of this is under the surface, as it were, but the idea is it's going to shape what the experience is like for us. Okay, so what anchors our naive sense that there are such properties of qualia are this set of reactive dispositions by which we acquaint ourselves with the sensible world. What that means here is that the world around us, the aspects of that world that we can sense, they evoke these reactions in us, and that is our take on them. Okay, so we're not just passively sitting there and letting this stuff wash over us. We're pushing back. We're changing our shape, as it were, in response to the stimulation that's coming in. We're adapting ourselves to it continually. Moving all these little sliders. More. Our sense that the color red has, as it were, an identity, a personality all of its own, is due to the host of different associations that go with each color. The way in which it's a bit more, I think, than just associations. The host of different reactions that you have to red things, some of which may be evolved responses. Maybe that red things. It does seem that red people generally find red environments more uncomfortable than say green ones. Seems to provoke a kind of raise stress levels as well. And many of them, of course, may be personal. Maybe all sorts of associations you have, particularly certain shades of color, certain smells that may evoke. Smells in particular can be very powerful. A smell can take you back to your childhood, to your grandmother's kitchen, to your garden, whatever. So it can be immensely potent. And the potency lies in the associations, the reactions, the way they move your sliders around. If, Dan says, there were creatures lacking all such reactive landmarks in their dispositional makeup, they would not think they had qualia at all. What it was like to have one sort of experience would not differ at all from what it was like to have a different one. So the idea is that this responsive side where all the action lies, not in some presentation, some mental quality being created and sort of given to you and say, yeah, mental quality, lovely. No, it's not in that. It's in all the downstream effects that the stimulus has upon you. And indeed, even if there were a mental quality produced, it still would not mean anything in itself. It would still be all the effects that the quality had that would generate the sense that something significant was happening, something interesting, something that you could talk about as a what the experience would like. It would still only in virtue of the effects. So you don't need the quality at all, as long as the effects are produced. That's where the action is. This is then it's great insight here. And this is what he says, supposing that there is something in addition to these complex families of reactive dispositions is falling for an illusion, plain and simple. It involves the natural but treacherous assumption that reactive dispositions must involve the person reacting to a qualia, an inner quality, presented somehow to the reactor, this Cartesian theatre, and causing by its presentation the reactor. You don't need an internal presentation of action. You've got your presentation already. It's the world. And you've got your reactor already. It's you and your this mentally complex cognitive system that nature has, and experience and personal development have equipped you with. You don't have to reproduce it all inside yourself again. And where the significance lies is in the complex families of reactive dispositions. And as he says here, the view that there is something in addition to the families of reactive dispositions, he said, my view is that this confuses cause and effect. It is the reactions that compose the introspectable property, the quality. And it is through reacting that one identifies or recognizes the property. It's not that there's the property there and then you go, oh, I'm going to react that. It's that there's the world there and you react to that. And it's by reflecting on your reaction, on how the world impacted on you, that you come to think that there's a mental property. Because, of course, one of the reasons for thinking there's a mental property is that sometimes you can have the reaction without the thing in the world that normally causes it. You might have an hallucination, say, and there all the reactions are the same, triggers the same reactive pattern, but there's nothing there to cause it. So you think, well, there must have been an internal version of the thing that normally causes it, an internal version of the smell or the color or whatever to cause it. No, the commonality wasn't in there being an internal version of the external quality. It was in there being the same pattern of reaction. This, I think, this line there, this confuses cause and effect, reactions that compose the introspectable property. And it's through reacting that one identifies the property. That, I think, it marks a little sort of Copernican revolution in thinking about consciousness. It's as significant as the change from thinking about the Earth as being at the center of the solar system and thinking about the sun as a center. It looks innocuous, as Dan puts it there, but the consequences are huge. Let's explore them.
And this was 31 years ago.
Pardon?
And this was 31 years ago. Amazing.
There are roots of this in many places, and it would be a really interesting exercise to trace them. I mentioned him when I was talking before, Brian Farrell's paper, Experience, which is a wonderful paper. There are lots of anticipation. I think Dan got this clearly and concisely, and he saw it. I think a lot of people have seen a bit of this picture, but Dan saw it really clearly. And he managed, he certainly communicated it to me very clearly. And once you see it, it becomes, I think, really quite compelling. And the alternative view begins to look very unattractive. Here's another illustration of this, and this is what the opening image should have morphed into that one, and then morphed back again. I spent some time creating an effect, but it didn't work. Okay, so if this is right, then there are two sides to experience. There is the perceptual side, there's the detection of properties in the world, and then there is the reactive side, the downstream side of reacting to them. Okay, not reacting to some intermediate. We don't need anything of that. We just need the detection of the properties and the reaction. It's not necessarily going to be a sharp boundary where the processing stops and the reaction start. There may be multiple strands of this, some starting early, with the reaction starting earlier than others. Very complicated. But there will be the possibility now of a dissociation between the perceptual side and the reactive side. And there's a very interesting case of this, where we know this happens. And this is Capgras syndrome, if that's the correct pronunciation. It's a delusion where people, so I'm just pouring some more tea there, where people believe that a close relative or close friend has been replaced by an imposter. They'll be absolutely convinced of this, even though they know that it doesn't really make any sense. And the explanation, well, one explanation for this that I'm not sure it's universally accepted, but it's certainly a leading candidate explanation for this, is that what has happened is that there's been a problem. There's a system, the brain has a system for face recognition. The visual processing system has regions dedicated to face recognition. And it seems that in these cases, this system's working fine. People still detect, they still recognize that this face of their loved one, is a face that is familiar to them. But what seems to have happened is that their reactions to that face have changed. They've suffered some deficit, suffered some damage to the emotional processing that goes along with face recognition. So that recognition of that face no longer evokes the same emotional response that it used to. So as it were, one bit of the brain is saying that recognize this face. This is the face of your wife or your close friend or whatever. But another bit of the brain is saying, this person doesn't feel like your wife. This person doesn't feel like, your close friend. So, and we, as it were, the whole person is just left with this conflict. On one side, they have this intuition. Yes, this is someone I know. This is a face I know. But at the same time, it doesn't feel like that person. So they try to make sense of this, and they say, maybe it's an imposter. Maybe it's someone who looks like them, but isn't actually them, because they would make me feel something that I'm not feeling, but it looks just like them. So they've kind of confabulated an explanation for this unusual situation they find themselves in. Now, then it imagines a case like this for color perception. It's not, I don't think there are any such cases have been discovered yet, though it seems a possibility there could be. And it's cases where he calls Mr. Clapgrass, who wakes up one morning and finds that everything looks odd, everything feels odd visually, all the visual world, everything just sort of seems strange. You can't quite pin it down, can't quite work out what's going wrong. Something's going wrong visually. but he's not sure what it is. And so he goes to see his doctor, a neurologist, and they do a lot of tests on him. And they discover that something very new, very strange has happened to him. When they ask him to classify colors, he does it perfectly. So they show him something yellow, he says it's yellow. They show a particular shade of yellow, something green. It can identify colors just as well as he always could. But when they test his emotional responses to color, they find they've changed. It happens in the story that he had been a subject in experiments for measuring people's emotional reactions to color. So they already knew what his previous reactions to different colors were, whether he found them comforting or stressful or whatever. So they've measured in very subtle ways his emotional reactions to colors, how they make him feel, whether they finds them calming or distressing or whatever. So they've already got this baseline of what his reactions to colors were like before, and they find they've all changed. So he recognizes something as being yellow, but now it produces in him the affective response, the emotional response that blue things used to produce. So he suddenly finds the banana now looks yellow. I mean, wait a minute, careful there. He knows it's yellow, he sees it, and he says, yes, that's yellow, but somehow it feels blue. Somehow it's producing the reaction that blue things produce. Now, you might imagine that would be, people don't like to eat blue things generally. They find them a bit off-putting. So he would look at the banana and say, well, it's yellow, but it's not yellow. It's how do you describe the situation? It's difficult to know. So here's how Dan puts it. Although Klappgratz does not complain of any problems of color vision, and indeed passes all standard color naming and color discriminating tests with, well, flying colors, he has undergone a profound inversion of all his emotional and attentional reactions to colors. Again, the things, not just his emotional, which colors capture his attention more. Say, if he found green things captured his attention, now he finds that red ones. What has happened to him, according to his doctor, Chromaphil, is simple. He's undergone a total qualia inversion while leaving his high-level cognitive color talents, its ability to discriminate and name colors, intact. Dan's not endorsing that last suggestion, but he's suggesting that that's how we might try to describe it. What's actually happened is his reactions have inverted. His color processing is just the same. Early, the processing of the visual cortex and so on is the same, but the downstream reactions have all shifted. That's what's happened. And that leaves him in a bewildered state. Things look the same and don't look the same. We might try to, as this doctor does, to say, well, that's a qualia inversion, but that's just a way of trying to find some sort of language to describe it. What's actually happened is that his reactions have inverted. Now, let's go on to another. So this is a distinction between the perceptual side, as it were, the upstream side, and the downstream perceptual processing, the reactive side. And it's locating the, it's suggesting that when we talk about the quality of experience, about what experience is like, we are tracking that downstream side. Although we're conceptualizing it differently, we're conceptualizing it as something upstream that we're reacting to, the qualia. But what we're actually tracking is the downstream effects. That's why we get in such a muddle with Mr. Klappgratz. Now, that's the question of what is being monitored, the suggestion that what is being monitored to create the illusion of the Cartesian theory is the reactive side of experience. That's the what. Monitoring of the downstream effects of perceptual discriminations. That's what's being tracked, the shape of those. Why? Why is this being tracked? Now, that's a good question. I'm going to invoke, going to appeal to some ideas from Nick Humphrey here. Actually, this section could be a lot longer, and this is really inadequate to Nick's, well, very inadequate to Nick's work. But then the talk would last even longer than it's going to. Now, he, like Dan, sees phenomenal consciousness. I'm using it in inverted commas there. He likes to use the word phenomenal here, though he isn't what I would call a phenomenal realist. He too sees a sharp distinction between perception. Let me say that again. He makes it so, like Dan, he sees phenomenal consciousness as essentially let me say that again. Like Dan, he sees the talk of phenomenal consciousness as tracking the reactive side of experience. And he makes a sharp distinction between perception and sensation, where perception is the thing that wasn't changed in Mr. Clapgrass, the ability to detect and classify features of the world and have beliefs about what their properties are. So Mr. Clapgrass still has exactly the same abilities to detect and classify features of the world and label them correctly. So perceptually, in the extent, he's not been affected. And this other side, sensation, where sensation, now we're talking about the, if you like, the what it's like aspect, the feely side of all this. I'm putting all these in inverted commas because I don't mean to invoke the phenomenal realist picture of qualia here. I'm talking about what it is that we're gesturing at with that talk. Okay, so the sensation side, and Nick sees a sharp distinction. He thinks they're actually separate systems in the brain for perception and sensation. Sensation being evolutionarily much older. And he sees the sensation system as based in a very ancient system of responses to stimuli. Perception is about, if you like, feeds into the cognitive side of the mind, forming beliefs and modeling the world. Sensation is about reacting to the world at a very basic level. And he says this sensation, he talks about sensation as kind of expression. Having a red sensation, this red response, this red feel, has something of the character of a bodily action, perhaps an expression. At any rate, it is an active first-person response. Again, all this emphasis on the reactive side to being stimulated with red light. And to bring this out, let's give a special active name to it. Redding. Okay, so you're perceiving red, you're detecting a red thing. Then when you're saying, okay, that thing belongs in the class of red of things we call red, and you're giving it this label red. That's all sort of world directed, but then you're responding to it in a distinctive way. You are not just detecting red, you're now reading yourself. You are responding in the red way to the thing. So the stimulus is the thing in the world is red, and it's making you, the verb is making you to red. It's making you red in response to it. Where this it doesn't involve producing some mental quality, it involves a pattern of reaction, of response, like the little sliders I talked about. Now, Nick develops a really sophisticated theory of the origin and the function of sensation and of its distribution in the natural world, which animals display this active response to stimulation and which don't, or which display it in different, more or less marked degrees. Very rich theory, which I think is one of the most worked out responses to what I call the illusion problem, which is the problem that the second problem I mentioned earlier of explaining why we're so why we find the phenomenal realist picture so attractive and compelling. And I can do no more here than just urge you to explore his work. Soulless is my favorite of these books, but they're all excellent. Nick doesn't like to talk about this as an illusion. And one reason he doesn't is he thinks that what's happening here is perfectly real. We are reading, we are responding redly, and this response it expresses something about the nature of the stimulus, expresses its meaning for us, and that's perfectly real. That's not an illusion, and I agree. The illusion is that there's a mysterious quality produced by the brain rather than this active response. And also he thinks that the word illusion has unattractive implications, that it suggests we're being deceived and that illusions, we're under some sort of, we're being misled. And we should try and see through this illusion and overcome it. And when you consider what is actually happening here, that this is an expression of the significance of the stimulus for us. Well, reading is an expression of what the stimulus means for us. That's not an illusion. That's not something we should try to overcome. That's very important. That's our take on the world. There's hardly anything more important than that. So he doesn't like to associate that with the word illusion. Of course, I'm not saying that's an illusion. I'm saying that the Cartesian theatre is an illusion. There's a cat. If you can hear it. So he thinks that the word, I think, is bad publicity. But the thing I want to just take from this is the idea that experience is expressive. That when we talk about the phenomenal side of experience, we're talking about how we're expressing the significance of the stimulus for us. This talk isn't describing an inner thing that we're aware of. It's expressing our response to the outer thing that's stimulating us. Now, focus on that idea, and then you get an answer to the why question. Why is this aspect being monitored? Why is this reactive aspect? Why is the brain going to the trouble of monitoring it and helping and enabling us to form beliefs about it? Well, because it'd be very useful to have knowledge of how the significance that stimuli have for you. Not for all creatures, I guess. Many creatures don't need to have beliefs about the significance of stimuli. That enough that the stimuli occur and they have this significance, that they are, say, distressing and evoke all the appropriate responses, or that they're, say, rewarding and they evoke those responses. Then they need to have beliefs about all of this. It's just enough that these responses happen. But in certain creatures like ourselves, perhaps, who are social creatures, having knowledge of this could be very, very useful, because it would enable us to think about the effect that stimuli have on us, to tell others about it, to say, avoid that, it's nasty, or try this, it's lovely, or it's, and we could think about wine tasting, how we try to characterize subtle differences in the effects of different wines. We're not describing some mysterious qualities in our head. We're describing the complex effects that the different wines have on us, and we're trying to conjure up bits of vocabulary and comparisons to express this. And this is useful to creatures like us who are social and want to share knowledge. So now you don't need to then actually experience. If someone tells me, "Don't try that wine," it's horrible, it's revolting, it saves me the trouble of investigating for myself. We can shortcut experience in a way that other animals can't. They can learn from experience. They can learn perhaps from seeing the effects that something has on another creature, but there's no way they can directly communicate the character of experience to each other in the way that we can. But for that, you need to have some sort of monitoring of the pattern of reactions that constitute what the experience is like. So this is why the monitoring occurs, so that we can form beliefs and make reports about the significance of stimuli for us. Finally, how? Should I just pause there? Is there anything?
No, I think it's good. I love the systematic approach of the why, what, and the how. It's also good to know for anyone who doesn't know, but I'm sure they would have listened to our previous conversations, is that Nick often calls it now surrealism rather than illusionism. However, Nick was firmly an illusionist for a long time.
He hasn't changed his views, I think. He has changed the way he wants to express his views, to describe them, to characterize them. But I don't think he's changed it. Oh, he has. Well, let me qualify that. He has refined and developed his views, but I don't think he's not changed. I still regard his position. I would call his position illusionist. I'm perfectly happy with that.
In fact, now he considers redder than red.
Redder than red. The point is, it isn't literally red.
Yeah.
That's the thing. It isn't. he's quite happy to say that there is some sort of distortion, caricature, exaggeration, something like that, that you shouldn't expect to find, and that is constituted by a pattern of reactions. You shouldn't expect to find red in the brain. Absolutely not. He's completely clear about that. There's no Cartesian data. There's no red in there, any more than there's a whale in Moby Dick. That's an example he uses. He says that the qualia, the brain activity stands to qualia as the text. I think I'm getting the text of Moby Dick stands to the whale. Okay, it's a kind of story about it. It's a story that is. I hope I got that right. The point is that what the brain's doing is writing a story about the significance of experience, and it's writing it, if you like, using the characters of qualia, okay, of these fields and so on. But what the story is actually telling us about is about the meaning and the significance of the stimulus. Just as I guess what Moby Dick, the story, is telling about, and what the whale is. The whale is, I guess, some sort of metaphor for something else. It's telling us about spiritual themes or something like that. I'm not sure I got that right, so don't quote me on that.
Yes, and he often, just to add to that, he often tries to make it clear that people understand that even though he doesn't believe that there is some sort of a red appearing in the brain, the mere fact that we're able to produce such an effect is what makes this so magical. The fact that that this is even possible is what makes it so surreal. And that's why it's pretty phenomenal. Phenomenal.
It's magical in the, in our other talk, I made this distinction that Dan liked to make between real magic, the sort that actually is supernatural, and wonderfully crafted illusions, stage magic, the sort that is real. Real magic isn't real. Real magic isn't real. The sort of magic that can actually be done isn't real magic. And I think when Nick talks about consciousness being magical, it means in the second sense, it's a wonderfully crafted effect, crafted by evolution. And this is the story that is set out in Solder. He thinks this effect has been crafted by evolution precisely to make us feel that there is something metaphysically special about ourselves, to create this sense of having this magical inner world enriches life and enriches our attachment to life and our valuation of each other. And so he thinks it's a if we're going to use the word illusion, it's a wonderfully positive illusion, a life-enhancing illusion.
And again, answers the why question.
And indeed, and gives a very, I mean, the why question, the answer to the why question could be, well, I suppose the answer could be, well, it's just a side effect of other processes. It's that the monitoring is actually done for some other purpose, and it creates this illusion. The illusion isn't created for its own sake. It's created as a side effect of other processes, mechanisms that have evolved for other purposes. Nick thinks it's evolved precisely to create that enhanced sense of our own specialness, and a specialness which he thinks we also, as it were, project onto the world. We see the world as charged with these qualities. So, as it were, our redding, we feel that the red things are sort of, it's us that is redding, but we feel that the world is vibrating with this redding that we are doing. And so our response is enlivening and energizing the world around us, it seems. And so the world becomes enchanted by our own response to it. It's a lovely story. And whatever word we use for it, it's among those theories that I'm trying to talk about, and it's one of a wonderful example of it. I urge people to read it. Okay, so let's just get on to the how then. How does all this create this? So I'm suggesting that what's being monitored is the reactive side, the downstream, as it were, side of experience, and that it's being monitored because that tells us something about the meaning of stimulation. How we react to a stimulus tells us something about the stimulus, what it means to us. Not to say to other creatures might respond very differently. One that moves my sliders in a certain way might move, say, a dog's sliders in a different way, or say a reptile's sliders very differently. So this is telling, and indeed, each of us will have idiosyncratic differences in how we respond. So this is something very personal. It's what that stimulus means to me. And that's because that's a valuable thing to know. That's why it's being monitored. But how does this, so I suppose that's what's happening. Why don't we just think of it in that way, in the way I just described? Why are we tempted to conceptualize this as a private world of private mental qualities that pose a hard problem of explanation? Why don't we just say, oh, it's monitoring my expressive responses to stimuli? Yeah, great, no problem in that. Let's find out what brain mechanisms are involved. Why does it create this illusion of phenomenality? And here's the third source that I'm appealing to, which is Michael Graziano's work, work with his colleagues as well, on the modeling of attention and what he calls attention schema theory, which is a play on that. That is why reactivity schema theory. Briefly, it goes like this. The idea is that the brain needs to control its own attentional mechanisms. Attention is a hugely important part of cognition. Getting attention wrong can be disastrous. So getting it right, focusing on the right bits of information at the right time, tracking the right things is essential to survival. Attention is absolutely crucial as a psychological mechanism. And it's what the brain should be able to control it effectively. But to control something, you need to have a model of it. So that you can adjust the different parameters. Okay. In different settings. But the model doesn't need to represent every detail of the thing. So if you're wanting, a map is a model, if you like, of the territory that you use to plan a journey and to control where you're going to go. The model doesn't need to contain all the information, all possible information about the every detail of the thing that you're modeling. In fact, it'd be useless if it did. It'd be too complicated. It just needs to capture the general outlines, particularly the dimensions that are that you want to control. And so it suggests that what the brain does is it constructs a simplified model of attention, which he calls an attention schema. And this model is it's constructed by self-monitoring systems within the brain, which model functional features of attention, the spread of attention, the direction, the intensity, how much attentional resources are being devoted, I guess, to a thing, the dynamics of it, how it's changing over time, and so on. So it models these functional features of attention. But it doesn't represent them as that. It represents them in a schematic way, as something more like an invisible force or essence. He says energy-like or plasma-like. The idea is it models attention as, I think he talks about it as if it's a force emanating, or an energy emanating from if it's visual attention, from the eyes, and locking onto things in the world and tracking them around and holding onto them and grasping information about them in a almost magical way. It's just locks onto them and grabs information about them. And then, having done that, it can have all sorts of effects on how we respond. Again, in a sort of magical way. There's no, the model doesn't contain any details of how this works. It's just this thing that flows out, as it were, grasps onto things, gets information about them, and makes things happen in a way that's apparently magical. Okay. Because that's all that's needed for the purposes of control. So provided you can control how this magical force is directed, what it latches onto, its spread, its intensity, and these sort of things, that's enough. That's all you need. You don't need to know all the mechanics of what's happening. It's a character. We could make a connection here with Janet's use of the analogy with the computer desktop, where you have the little icons for the waste bin and so on. There isn't really a waste bin in there. It's a useful metaphor. Put something in, it deletes it. That's good for control purposes. What's actually happening is that long strings of ones and zeros on your hard disk are being, well, not actually, they're not all being deleted, just the header will be deleted or something, and the space made available for future, for writing over. So it's but for control purposes, that little the representation of the waste bin is really useful. Similarly, this representation of attention as a almost magical force is fine for control purposes. Now, when we ask ourselves, when we reflect and think, what am I attending to? What's happening at the moment with me? When we introspect again, and we ask ourselves, what we're attending to, or we access information from that model, as it were. Where information from that model guides the judgments that we form, the beliefs that we form, not in an explicit way. It's not that we sort of think, okay, I'm now going to access this model, and it's just that we ask ourselves, what am I attending to now? And information from this model prompts us to form certain beliefs about it. That I'm latched onto that thing there, and I'm tracking it, or whatever it might be. And because that information has this schematic character, it leads us to judge that these experiences we're having are themselves sort of magical subjective states, that we're having this state of being sort of locked onto this thing in a magical way and grasping information about it in a way that doesn't involve any mechanism. We just see it and woof, information there, and this information then has effects on us that in a sort of magical way, because we have no idea of the mediating processes. All we have is a schematic outline of this grasping of information in the experience, and and this being potent in affecting us. So the schematic character of the model then induces us to form this conception of our minds, which is essentially dualistic, okay, which is that there are immaterial processes occurring. There's an immaterial sort of grasping of things, information. And this is what leads us to talk about qualia, and to conceive of our minds as having a non-physical aspect. It's due to the simplified modeling. Now, excuse me. Now I think that's a really interesting account. I doubt if I did it justice there. There's Michael has several books on this. That's a nice introductory paper setting out the approach toward a standard model of consciousness. And I think it is certainly a contribution to a standard model of consciousness. I think it's a very important contribution, but I want to extend it a bit more beyond the realm of attention only, because after all, attention is one of the early stage processes, and we've not said much about reactivity in this picture. So I want to extend it back and pull it back and apply this same sort of approach to the reactive side of experience, what we were talking about earlier, because for Graziano, for Michael, the what is attention. And I suggested the what is downstream reactivity. So let's try and apply the same approach, this schematic modeling approach, to the reactive side. And this is where we get reactivity schema theory. As I said, I don't want to tie the approach too closely to Michael's approach, because I want to leave it open for development in ways that would be a bit different from that. So maybe reactivity theory would do. Okay, so I will plunge into this if you all have patience. Any questions?
Yeah, I think continue. And it's just, if anyone wants to check out the book you were referring to, it's called Rethinking Consciousness, The Science of Subjectivity.
Yeah,
Michael.
Definitely. Yes, there should have been a link. Okay, so now let's go into this. I'll
put links below, Keith. No stress, no worries.
Fantastic. Okay, so perception and reactivity. Let's just recapitulate this process. So here we have a person looking at an apple. And what happens is that there is what you might call upstream perceptual processing. The red color here is not meant to reflect the color of the apple. The red color in the processing is meant to reflect the incoming side. I'm going to use green for the outgoing side, for the reactive side. Upstream perceptual processing, sort of thing that happens in the visual cortex, although in other areas too. Detection of features, edges, orientations, colors, construction of 2.5D models, object recognition, increasingly complex classification of the visual scene, the sort of thing that visual vision theory is all about. And usually this is seen as it were, sort of culminating in consciousness. Then you get enough of this done enough ways, and then something else happens, and it's ignited into a global
workspace.
What's the word? Into global workspace, and then bang, consciousness. You got it. So that's sort of the culmination of this side. My picture's a bit different. Let's then look at the downstream effects of perception, the multitude of psychological and behavioral reactions it triggers, or primes. And this overlaps, of course, because some of these will start earlier than others. There'll be lots and lots of them. Some start early, some start later. And these are the things I was talking about earlier, like these changes, little sliders on different aspects of emotion, memory, motor response, attention, indeed. Feedback into the control of attention. Some of these responses will be genetically shaped. Maybe certain colors have a certain effect on most of us. Red is uncomfortable. Others will be learned ones that we have acquired during the course of our personal history. And that we may call the reactivity pattern. Now, the whole of that. Now, sometimes this reactivity pattern is quite limited. If the stimulus isn't being targeted by attention, then the content, a bit of information that is carried by the information about the stimulus doesn't get to have a huge range of effects, doesn't become famous. Metaphor, fame in the brain, doesn't become conscious. It just fades out. And that's what this is meant to convey here. So the processing builds up, and then the reactions just fade out. It's not, doesn't get to be conscious. But sometimes, see, little noise there. Sometimes it's extensive. The stimulus is attended, and the content has a huge downstream effect. It becomes famous. It affects lots and lots of different systems. You might liken this to global broadcast, and yeah, okay, but it's not dependent on any particular theory of the architecture here. It's just saying there is a big boom of effects. It becomes famous. It becomes conscious. We could fill this in with all sorts of different stories about the architectures involved, but it's not necessary to get the picture. Sometimes there's a big reactivity.
I don't think I think it's okay to say the global workspace, the broadcast occurs, because when I spoke to Michael, he actually said if you take attention schema theory, you could actually prop it onto global workspace theory, and they work well together. And then obviously we know that Michael's theory eventually leads to an illusionist or caricatured account. So it actually
he doesn't like the term illusion, but it is thoroughly illusionist. But yes, it's just that I don't want to. It depends how I think specific you want to be about the architecture of the global workspace. If you're just waving your hands and saying there's a lot of effects, then I'm fine with that. But I'm not sure. I think I want to know what you. I mean, for instance, the role of working memory, for instance.
The technicalities behind how. And
there's a lot of technicalities which I just want to skip over here.
No worries, just keep going. Yeah.
This isn't so much a theory, although I use the word theory, as a framework within which I suggest theorizing could be done to get more detailed answers to this. So there'll be lots of ways of developing this, and certainly global workspace theory.
Perhaps a reactivity schema principle or reactivity principle.
Something like that might be, yes, something like that, yeah. Okay, so let's concentrate on this case where the perceptual process does result in this boom of effects. We reach supersonic velocities. Now, This reactivity pattern, I suggest, could be mappable on multiple dimensions, corresponding to various dispositional features of the stimulus, as disposition to affect us in different ways, sort of attractiveness, perhaps, dangerousness, edibility. We can all sorts of different, think of all the different ways in which a stimulus could affect you, all the different reactions it could dispose you to have. Each of these could correspond to a dimension of this. So we can map it in this multi-dimensional space. Now, the shape of that reactivity pattern in the multi-dimensional space encodes information about the significance of the stimulus for the object. If you know the shape of that reactivity pattern, you know what that stimulus means for the subject. I guess a particular sort of stimulus, say, let's say water to a mammal, I guess it's going to have a certain sort of similar pattern of reactions across a wide range of different species, or this sort of, well, let's say the typical foods for an animal, say for I don't know, for a monkey, say fruit, let's say, I can guess it's going to have a similar sort of reactivity pattern across the whole, most members of the species, but it might be tweaked in individual ways for particular ones, depending on their particular interactions with that fruit and associations, learned associations and so on. Now, if you know what the reactivity pattern is for a particular stimulus, for a particular creature, you know a lot about the significance that thing has for the creature. You know whether it's a threat, it's an opportunity, it's something that it will, you know, how, whether it's an opportunity for it to do something, an invitation for it to engage in a certain sort of activity, whether it's figures more as a warning for it to retreat, to keep away. You know a lot about it. And the more you know about the shape of it, the more you know about the significance of it. It tells you about the affordances that the stimulus offers. Affordances is a term introduced by the psychologist J.J. Gibson. It means the opportunities for action that the thing presents. These may be positive. It might be the apple affords eating. It also maybe affords throwing at a rival. Other things may afford fleeing, running away. Something threatening display may afford fleeing. The affordances are the significances for action that a thing has for you. And of course, the same thing will have different affordances for different creatures. Creatures that can't eat apples won't see it as an opportunity for eating. The threats will have different effects on different creatures. The same threat display will have different effects on different creatures. So it encapsulates the shape of the reactivity pattern, encapsulates the affordances the stimulus offers for this individual, both for this animal of this type and for this particular individual of that type. Now, this is information that's very much worth having. For certain sorts of creatures, this is very much worth having this information about your own reactivity patterns. Not for all creatures. For, say, let's say a monkey, say, probably he doesn't need to know the significance of the apple. It's just enough that the apple has that significance for it, and that it triggers these reactions, that it follows out the promptings that the stimulus presents. doesn't really need to reflect on this and think about it. Although maybe perhaps actually with monkeys, we may be getting closer to the area where it is useful. Certainly for if you think of reptiles and so on, they don't need this information. They just need stimuli to have significance for them. It's enough that they have the significance. So, but for creatures that are capable of communication with each other, it will be really, really useful to have this sort of information, to know what the significance of stimuli are for animals like them. Because you can share this information. You can say, that's a really nice thing to eat. That's really tasty. That's really horrible. Don't keep away from that. It's dangerous. It's frightening. Whatever. We can shortcut experience. We don't, because we can share information about how things affect us. We don't. Each of us need to experience the thing itself to realize how it affects us and to learn from experience. We can learn from communication about experience. We can share information about experience offline, as it were. Other animals have to learn through bitter experience each time. If a dog tastes something and it makes it sick, it can't go and tell another dog, don't eat that. It's gone off. The other dog's going to have to find out for itself. And all sorts of bad consequences could ensue. We can shortcut that. We can undergo the reaction, notice that we've undergone the reaction, find words to express the nature of the reaction, and tell someone, shortcutting experience. We can also use this information to make strategic decisions about our own, about what experiences we're going to have. We can decide to cultivate experiences that we like. We don't just have to wait until opportunities present themselves for eating apples. We can actually plan to seek out apples. And we can, if there are particular fruits we like, we can plan how to get them, how to find them. We don't have to just wait until opportunities present themselves till we see them around us and then go and get them. We can plan to produce certain kinds of stimulation that are not present, to cultivate experiences that are positive ones for us. So extracting this information that's encoded in the reactivity pattern is a very useful thing for us as reflective social creatures to do. Now, so I said that reactivity could be modeled. No, sorry, I said that it would be useful to have this information. So let's suppose then that there are mechanisms in the brain for getting this information, for getting the information about the shape of the reactivity pattern. So let's suppose that the brain has systems that monitor the shape of the reactivity pattern. Again, as with Graziano's model of attention, it doesn't need to model all the detail, all the little gray lines inside the green mass. They are meant to indicate the complexity of the reactivity pattern. We don't need to know all the details. We don't need to know the precise nuances. We're not all wine tasters who are trying to tease out every fine detail of our response. We just need to know the general shape of it among the major axes. So let's suppose that the brain has systems that monitor the reactivity pattern and create a simplified schematic model of it, a reactivity schema. So it just gets the general outline of the thing, like then the little cloudy image there. Now, what you've got there then is a model of the reactivity pattern created here by the stimulus, which is in this case an apple. But there's no point in having a model of the significance of a stimulus unless it's linked to a representation of the stimulus itself. You need to know what stimulus created this reaction. You need to, as it were, bind the bits of information together. So let's suppose that the perceptual processing generates some, the perceptual side, the classificatory side, remember, as in Nick's distinction between perception and sensation. So there's a side that's detecting and classifying bits of the world, and then there's the other side that's reacting. So let's suppose here that the reactive bit is linked up to information from the pure perceptual side. So there's some sort of encoding of the perceptual content, an apple, say, some sort of mental representation of an apple, which is linked to, bound to the reactivity schema. So now what we have is a representation of the content bound to a representation of the effect of the effects of the perception of that. No. Let me say, sorry, I'm getting rather tired. We have information about the nature of the stimulus, that it's an apple, bound to a representation of the effects of the stimulus, the reactions it provokes. So we are now, as it were, experiencing the apple as something that's affecting us in a certain way, courtesy of these mechanisms. And then, as we change the stimulus, we change the pattern of reactivity, change the shape of the reactivity schema, which is a schematic representation of the reactivity pattern. And of course, it's bound to a different perceptual content here. Perceptual content here is banana. Again, green pepper, different shape of reactivity, different reactivity schema, bound to a different perceptual content. Pain, I suppose the reactivity pattern of pain looks like that. Again, another reactivity schema bound to another perceptual content. So in each case, we have available to us a representation of the stimulus as something that's provoking a certain responsiveness, a certain complex adjustment to our internal sliders. So now, when bound to the perceptual content in that way, the perceptual content simply being a representation of what the stimulus is, the reactivity schema represents the stimulus as something that affects us in a certain way, as something that affords certain responses, that has a certain personal significance for us. But it does that in a very simplified, schematic way. There's no representation of the mechanisms involved in this. Just as with the attention schema, it doesn't model all the mechanics of attention. It models the dynamics of it, where it's directed, how intense it is, what it's grasping on, what it's latching onto, where that could be some mysterious magical fluid or energy, plasma, I think that's the only use of the word, source that is doing that. Mechanics aren't represented, just the dynamics. Again, here, what is represented is just the content. It's a banana, and it's having this significance for us, the significance of that shape, this shape, where there's no representation of that shape being realized in a complex pattern of responses that are of adjustments to affective systems, memory systems, attentional systems, cognitive, other belief-forming systems, and so on. It's just represented as a significance shape. Now, that information then, of course, there's no point having that information unless it's made available to other systems that can do something with it. So we suppose that information is then made available to higher cognitive processes, for example, for reflective decision-making, strategic planning. So you can think about, you can reflect on that experience and I'll make sure that experience doesn't happen again. Or that was really quite nice. I'll try and find an opportunity to cultivate that experience again. And of course, to speech. So you can tell people about the experience. You can share the experience, save them having to try it out for themselves. You can be a proxy. You can experience by proxy once you can monitor the shape of your own reactions to stimuli and form beliefs about that and form reports about that. We can have experience by proxy, which is one of the wonderful things that human culture has. And perhaps maybe there are other apes that can do something a bit like that, but it's pretty unique to humans, I think, experience by proxy. So this enables us to report, reflect on, and anticipate the impact of stimuli. It also enables us to hack our own reward systems. Once we've noticed that something is nice, we can cultivate that reaction for its own sake. There's a point of, there's an evolutionary reason why sugar evokes the certain sort of reaction it does. And I suppose maybe this is a bit simplistic, but that sugars were relatively rare in our ancestral diet, and so we made the most of them when we got them. but we can hack that. We can say, oh, I like the taste of sugar, so I'll cultivate that. I'll have some more. I'll go and buy some and stir it in my food and so on. Which of course has its own drawbacks, but it's something we're able to do because we have this measure of self-knowledge and self-control. Thus, we become reflectively aware of the affordances of things. Things have affordances for all creatures. Stimuli afford actions to all creatures, but we, perhaps uniquely, can be reflectively aware of those affordances, think about them, talk about them, make plans on that basis. And I think the consequences of this for human culture are just vast. Once you think about this, we can hack our. I think we can hack our reward systems. We can use contraception, for example. So, where do we get the illusion? Where does the illusion come into this? Well, so here's the thought. As with Graziano's account, when we reflect on our experience, when we try to describe our experience, when we try to think about it, try to communicate it, we draw on the information representations in the reactivity schema. Again, it's not like we sort of look at the reactivity. It's not like we know there's a reactivity schema when we look it up. It's just that that information is there to. It's what prompts our beliefs about. When we ask ourselves, where do our beliefs come from? When you ask us, what is this experience like? Well, the belief just comes to you. You don't have to actually sort of look it up or search it out. It just comes to you. Where does it come from? Well, it comes from the reactivity schema. That's the idea. So the reactivity schema is kind of operating in the background, producing beliefs when you ask for them, as it were. When you say, what's this like? Well, the reactivity schema tells you. This provides information, I suggest, about the shape of the current reactivity pattern along various dimensions, and also its relation to other patterns. So if there's systematic, there will be systematic relations between patterns, particularly ones that are associated with the same sensory modality, different color experiences, say, they'll be related in all sorts of systematic ways, which will be captured in the shape of the pattern. And so you will be able to, when you form reports on this basis, you will say, it's like that one. You might not be able to articulate exactly how it's like it, but you will say it's like that experience, or this taste is a bit like the taste of blackberries or whatever, or it's got a sort of oily kind of thing to it. Again, these judgments I'm suggesting reflects similarities and differences in the patterns of reactivity and their corresponding schemas. But as with the attention schema thing, all of the detail of this is omitted. All you have, all that the reactivity schema captures are the general outline. The schema presents experience as something like an abstract pattern. All of that those little fine gray lines inside the green star there are lost. You just have the outline of the thing. So it presents experience to you as something abstract, intangible, an essence of significance. It has that significance, the significance that's a bit like the significance of that other thing. And maybe you can say, I like it, or I don't like it, or it inclines me to do this or that or whatever, but I can't really tell you more about it because I've got nothing there's no structure available to me, really. I can just make comparisons and general evaluations, and that's all I've got. It's just this essence of significance. We might say it's a pure feel. It's an ineffable feel that I'm acquainted with. It isn't. There's no ineffable feel there. There's no quality there. There's a pattern of complex downstream reactions that have been schematically modeled, and the schematic modeling produces my judgments about them, and those judgments about them I tend to express in the only way I can as, well, it's got this feel. Hence, the illusion of phenomenal consciousness. The answer to the illusion problem, the answer to life, the universe, and everything. It's not 42, it's the reactivity schema theory. Final slide, you'll be glad to know. This has been going on a long time. Okay, someone says...
Firstly, before you finish this final slide, I just want to say that was very, very good. I'm enjoying it. Don't worry about time.
That's very generous. Okay.
Take
So
me-
someone says to me, okay, look, that's very grand, and you've sat there and you've thought about this, and this, you've come up with this, and maybe, how would you test it? Good question. Very, very good question.
Important question.
And it's a question that should be asked a lot more of all theories of consciousness. Unfortunately, too many theories of consciousness are not testable. They are simply a sort of a priori balancing of different intuitions. We have a bunch of intuitions about consciousness. We're trying to find a way of metaphysics, usually metaphysical theory that respects those intuitions as well as we can, and then we we find we have to bite a bunch of bullets, and we bite the ones that we find most palatable, and that's our theory of consciousness. Very few of them actually stick their necks out and make testable predictions. And in fact, some of them just couldn't possibly generate testable predictions. Many forms of panpsychism just don't do any testable predictions at all. And that's not a criticism, because they're not trying to. But if you think that testable predictions are a good thing, well, that's a different matter. So here are some. These are really just questions, just things you could look into if you would want to take it seriously. Well, obviously, you could try to locate the activity schema in the brain and say, well, what we need to look for I said there was neural mechanisms that do these things, that do this monitoring, this modeling, that feeding to higher order cognition. So, okay, so let's find them. We should be able to detect them if they're there. Of course, detecting anything in the brain is tough. Given the wonderful techniques that we have at present, there's still we're still at the very, very early stages of this. I think sometimes perhaps data from neural imaging and so on gives the impression that we can do sort of finer resolution than we can. But anyway, this is something we should in principle be able to do. So we need to look for neural processes which have these features. They carry information about system-wide patterns of reactivity. Okay, so there need to be some brain system that is mapping global patterns of activity. Not in detail, but mapping the general shape. So it'd be kind of looking at the levels of activity in different areas simultaneously, maybe, and creating some sort of average of it, or not average, schema of it. These processes should be active when we introspect, because when we introspect, we are tapping information from the reactivity schema, and maybe the reactivity schema isn't constructed all the time. Maybe it's just constructed on a need-to-know basis. So when you ask yourself, what's this experience like, it kind of wakes up and kicks in and starts doing some calculations. So it certainly should be active when we're introspecting, maybe not so much at other times. So introspection should certainly boost its activity, I guess. Here's a suggestion. It's also plausible to think it's active in empathy, because when you're trying, maybe this is something I haven't mentioned at all, but empathizing kind of involves you simulating the reactions that the other person is undergoing, and sort of feeling their feeling. So this suggests that maybe one thing that's involved in empathy, I'm a philosopher, I can throw this out like, just speculate like this, is that we are doing sort of offline reactivity modeling. We're sort of activating the representation, a reactivity schema for a certain kind of experience that we're not having, but which we think the other person is having, and we're sort of imagining their feelings. So this suggests that the reactivity schema might be active when we are empathizing, and indeed there might be problems with the reactivity schema in people who have problems with empathy. So we might find it more developed in people with high empathy levels, etc. Lots of stuff we could do. So we could try and look for processes in the brain that implement the functions that are involved in creating and using a reactivity schema. Second thing we could do is we could look at dissociations between perception and reactivity. So this is just the general point here, is that on the approach I'm suggesting, it's premised on this distinction between perception and reactivity. And the idea is that reactivity is the core of the in scare quotes, phenomenal side of consciousness. So if we had people whose reactivity was damped down somehow, while their perceptual activity was still normal levels, then we might expect them to give different reports of what their experience was like. So if there are low levels of activity to the same stimuli, while the perceptual processing is the same, then that would be a sign that we're on the right track in locating I keep doing this thing, but the talk about phenomenal consciousness as tracking the reactive side of things. And one example of this, of course, is blind sight, where it seems that the people are able to their perceptual abilities are not well, they are compromised, certainly, but they can certainly detect and reliably classify stimuli, but they don't have any sense of actually experiencing them. In blind sight, people usually they have damage to the visual cortex, and a certain area of their vision seems blank to them. But if you ask them to guess what's there, they can't see anything. They don't react to what's there. But if you ask them to guess, if you prompt them, they can often guess right about what's there, about say the orientation of a line or something like that. They can even catch a ball that is thrown to them in that area. So there's some of the perceptual side is preserved without the reactive side. Now, exploring other dissociations between perception and reactivity could tend to support this sort of thing. Again, Mr. Clapgrass is an example of that, where there's been an inversion of reactivity with unchanged perception. Even more interestingly, perhaps we could explore dissociations between reactivity and the reactivity schema. What happens if reactivity is the same, but the schematic modeling of it is distorted? What if that was what happened with Mr. Clapgrass? Suppose his affective reactions to color hadn't changed. Suppose we look at his emotion, the emotion centers in the brain, and we find that the emotions triggered by different emotions, perhaps effective responses triggered by different colors have stayed the same, even though he says it feels funny. What if it's the modeling of reactivity that's broken down rather than the reactivity itself? It should be possible on this count. So it'd be interesting to, has anyone ever asked whether there are dissociations between reactivity and the modeling of reactivity? I don't know if anyone's ever asked it, so let alone explored it. Something that could happen. So we could have a sort of second order blind side where the person is reacting, detecting a stimuli, is reacting to it, but isn't aware that they're reacting to it. So they have normal reactivity with absent or distorted modeling of it. So they would be like, their position would be like that, I guess, of non-human animals who don't model reactivity at all because they don't need to talk about it. They're just reacting and living in the world, and they still have the first order consciousness that's constituted by the reactivity, but they can't access it. They can't think about it. They can't talk about it. Maybe certain sorts of, that could be Clapgrass's situation. It could perhaps be the case with certain sorts of psychopathies, with certain sorts of mental illness. Perhaps the modeling of reactivity is damped down, while even though it's the reactivity itself is still normal. Anyway, it's possible. Explore whether the reactivity schema can be modified through training. Could we ramp up the sensitivity? I said it was schematic, it was simplified, it was perhaps positively distorted as well. I don't want to present the reactivity schema as merely simplified, as merely missing out information. It could be that it involves positive distortion, positive caricature, surreal aspects. But can that schema be modified through training? Can we learn to make finer discriminations among our own reactivity, not just to increase our reactivity, our first order reactivity, but to increase our discrimination of the reactivity that is already occurring? Maybe that's what happens in wine tasting. Is it that you're detecting more things, or you're becoming aware of more detections that you make? Is it a refinement at the higher order level or the first order level, or both? There should be ways of teasing these out experimentally. explore whether the reactivity schema can adapt to represent artificially distorted reaction patterns. Suppose we could find a way of, say, damping down reactivity in the brain. Could we ramp up the modeling to compensate? Or suppose, let's say, I mean, it's all complete blue sky thinking here. Suppose that psychedelics distort reactivity, distort the first order reactivity, which I think they pretty obviously do. Now, suppose you were taking psychedelics regularly, and so your patterns of reactivity were continually distorted. Could you learn to adjust the modeling of it to compensate, so that you kind of ignored the extreme reactions that were getting in the way of your functioning? You would still be reacting in an abnormal way, but you might be able to control your representation of that and talk about it in a more reflective way that compensated for the distortion. I don't know. It seems that there should be a possibility of dissociation between reactivity and the schema. Explore whether reactivity schema can shed light on psychopathies, including various types of neglect and delusion. Could certain sorts of delusions and neglect be due to failures of reactivity modeling rather than to failures of reactivity themselves? So, as in the Clapgrat syndrome, where in Clapgrat syndrome, yes, there is a failure of reactivity. Spool back. Let me. That doesn't work. Let's take Cotard delusion. Cotard delusion is the delusion that you are dead. You don't feel alive. Now, what could explain that? Well, one possibility is perhaps that you're not reacting to stimuli in the way that you normally do. The reactivity is damped down. But again, another possibility might be that you're not modeling reactivity normally, that it seems to you that you're not reacting, even though you are. That when you ask yourself what this experience is like, even though it's having the normal dimensions of response are occurring, you're not finding them when you introspect. So you're still functioning, but when you ask yourself what it's like for you, you kind of come up with a blank. You're not any longer able to access information about this the phenomenal aspect of experience anymore. And so you're inclined to say, well, it doesn't feel like anything. It just feels empty. I just feel nothing. There couldn't really be nothing, because if you're alive, you're going to be reacting. But it could be that your modeling of how you're reacting has failed, and you just feel lost. So maybe that could work. Lots and lots to speculate about. I literally wrote those in 5 minutes. They may not all be coherent ideas, but I'm sure there are lots and lots of potential for exploring this idea if you take the framework seriously. That was the end of the talk. So it's a good job the talk came to an end there, because I was losing it.
Is that just to refer to us to a slap in the face, just to remind us to wake up at the end?
To remind me to stop, I think.
Another way to try and think about it, I think that would be great, would be considering dream states, particularly the differences between REM and non-REM sleep, because the information that sort of portrays there during sleep states, part of it's conscious, part of it's unconscious. So, well, in that sense, so it could be a good way to scan the brain, see what's happening and what type of reactivity patterns occur. Yes, I mean, certainly, that's interesting. What I'm suggesting here is that we have there's a kind of three-way dissociation. There's the upstream perceptual processing, there's the activity, and then there's the modeling of the reactivity. And the modeling of the reactivity comes in when we try to introspect. So I guess... Do you think at that point, when someone's asleep, do you think there's absolutely no part of introspection occurring?
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? That
Yeah.
I mean, there's lucid dreaming, certainly.
Yeah.
And I don't know, maybe this would be, this is an interesting thing to try to explore independently, is are highly introspective people, are their dreams, do they introspect in their dreams? Do they find themselves reporting dreams in which they introspect? If dream life is a reflection of the sort of activities you do in waking life, then I expect that highly introspective people would find themselves introspecting in dreams. As I say, this is maybe there is work here that I should know about, and if there is work here, please, anyone listening, get in touch, because I want to follow it up. But I until you make this distinction between reactivity and the modeling of reactivity, there are certain questions that you can't ask.
Yes.
And so, well.
Oh, I think it was a beautiful lecture, Keith. Thanks so much for that. What we'll do is, because we've already had a 3+ hour conversation, and then this wonderful lecture, I think what we'll do is we'll post this out. We'll see what the responses are. Anyone can just leave us their questions in the comment sections below, and I'll curate a bunch of them. If anyone has any ideas where Keith needs to work on certain aspects, improve upon, or things you just want to congratulate and tell him thanks for the insightful information, just let us know.
Fantastic. Yes, if you get a lot of responses, I'll be happy to come back and discuss some of them.
No, I think we definitely will at some point. The question is, oh yeah, and another thing, if anyone has any ideas and would like to take this further, they most certainly should.
Well, I hope that it's, you see, what can philosophers contribute to cognitive science? One thing they can do is try to synthesize material, read a lot of experimental work, try and pull it together, maybe do some philosophy of science, think about the frameworks and the concepts that people are using, the methodologies, criticize those. This sort of serious sort of philosophical underlaboring that philosophers can do, and it's really useful stuff. And I don't really do much of it myself, I confess, but it's really useful. But another thing I think we can do is maybe a bit of blue sky thinking. Psychologists and neuroscientists wouldn't be allowed to speculate in this way. It would be just considered terribly unprofessional. But philosophers are licensed jesters at the academic court, and we can jump up and down and say, wave a little thing and say, and you never know. Sometimes we might be onto something.
And it's a privilege for me to be the host of the gestures and and just to bring this to the audience. I hope anyone listening or watching tries their best to engage, interact, and that's what this platform is all about. It's to give you guys the opportunity to explore these.
Absolutely. I very strongly believe that, I mean, obviously there are resources available to academics that are not available to the general public, and so you have to, at some point, you have, certainly if you wanted to experiment, but you have to get involved in that way. But there's a lot of ways in which committed amateurs, in the best sense, can contribute. Think about something like astronomy. A lot of amateur astronomers do some very important work. Admittedly, it's probably a fairly routine sort, but even observing variable stars and this sort of thing, you can get involved. And I think you can. And first of all, it's important to get involved in this because we all want to know answers to these questions. And we want to know about what nature of our own minds, nature of consciousness. Who could be a conscious being without wanting to understand something about this? So it's important for our own sake. But I think there are ways in which people outside academia, on the borders of academia, can contribute. If there are channels for communication between them and the people, as it were, inside academia, and this is what podcasts like yours can do.
That's exactly all of this.
Important. I mean, we started talking a previous talk at the beginning, talking about AI and the risks and the opportunities presented by new forms of AI. This is much too important to leave to the academics to think about this. We all need to be involved, but we all need to be informed to think about it. It's no good just sitting there and sort of speculating on the basis of a bunch of articles you've read in the newspaper. You need to inform yourself well.
And I think the perfect place to do it is to have that platform that's sort of an edutainment, bridging that gap between entertainment and educational academic content, because academia needs to be brought to the public.
Like the ancient marketplace in Athens where Socrates did his this sort of digital marketplace, digital agora. Maybe that's where we can communicate.
I'll be in Athens in end of September, so I'll give you a call, Keith, and hopefully I can make a quick stop in Crete.
That would be fantastic. That would be fantastic. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to do this. I hope I wasn't too incoherent.
No, I think it was absolutely lovely, and I appreciate you taking the time out to do this for me, and the audience, I'm sure, will be very grateful as well.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Keith. Have a wonderful evening, and this was really a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Pleasure to talk to you again.